This is for Tuesday, March 20th. So as I said before, there are three systems that are essential to know for the AP exam. That would be the immune system, the endocrine system, and the nervous system. So in chapter 45, we're going to look at the endocrine system. So you're not going to have to know every single one of these hormones, but there are certain hormones that you should be able to recognize. If you see a question on the endocrine system, they should give you all the background information that you're going to need, and they'll probably give you some type of diagram. So just first to get started, hormones, as we've mentioned before, are chemical signals that are secreted into the circulatory system, and then they're going to move throughout the body in the circulatory system, in the blood, to be able to communicate different messages within the body. Okay. The thing is that hormones are able to reach all parts of the body, but they're not going to act on every single cell. Only the cells with the appropriate target receptor will be able to receive the hormone signal and thus be able to have the response to that hormone. And as we've mentioned multiple times, different cells are going to have different pathways within those cells. So every cell may respond differently to the hormone. So there's two main systems that work to allow your body to be regulated. It's the endocrine system and the nervous system. As I said before, two of these systems that we really need to know. So the endocrine system works using hormones. And so it causes it to be a slow coordination, but it's long lasting. So it's slow because of the fact that it has to go into the bloodstream, and then you have to wait for the bloodstream to bring that hormone to the appropriate target cell. And it's also long acting because of the fact that it takes so long to get it out of your bloodstream. And it usually is going to work with reproduction, development, energy, metabolism, growth, and behavior. Versus the nervous system works with electrical signals. The neurons are going to transfer electrical signals using sodium and potassium ions. And so these will be kind of a quick response, and they're also short acting. So just like we mentioned in chapter 11, the chemical signals are going to bind to some type of receptor protein. Depending on that chemical signal is where this receptor is going to be. If the signal is nonpolar, the receptor will be inside of the cell. It'll be an intracellular receptor. If this signal molecule is polar, then we're going to find that the receptor protein will be found on the membrane. So now only the target cells will respond to the signal because only the target cells will have the appropriate receptor for that signal. And so there's a couple different examples of signal molecules. There's hormones, local regulators, neurotransmitters, neurohormones, and then pheromones. And we're going to look at each of these individually. So hormones are just endocrine signals, and they're secreted into the extracellular fluid, and then they travel within the bloodstream. So usually any gland that releases these hormones are ductless, so there's not really a path that takes it down there. It just literally just secretes it directly into the surrounding fluid. It goes through exocytosis, which just releases it into interstitial fluid, and then interstitial fluid will allow it to get into the bloodstream. And hormones usually help with environmental stimuli, regulating growth, development, and of course reproduction. Local regulators are going to be chemicals that go short distances, and we've looked at these before. So if you're talking about paracrine signaling, para means next to. So paracrine signaling is going to act on a cell that's in a surrounding area. So para means next to, so paracrine signaling binds to cells that are nearby or next to. Autocrine signals, auto meaning me or self, means that the signal is going to actually act on the same cell, the cell that's secreting it. So it usually will go through exocytosis, release the signal, and then it will bind to a receptor on its own cells. And then these local regulators will help with blood pressure, nervous system function, and of course reproduction. So here you can see a picture of paracrine signaling. So we have exocytosis releasing the signal out into the surrounding area. And then that signal is going to bind to the surrounding cells that have the appropriate receptor. Because this receptor kind of has like more of a V shape instead of a semicircle shape, the circular signals will not bind there and instead will bind to these cells that have the appropriate receptor. Down here we see with the autocrine that we go through exocytosis, which is releasing again those chemical signals, and then they bind to a receptor on the same cell. Neurotransmitters and neurohormones are going to work within the nervous system. These are chemical signals that are part of the nervous system. So the neurons, when they're sending the signal within the neuron, it's usually an electrical signal. But at the end of one neuron, before it binds to the next neuron, there's going to be this little space. This space is called a synapse. And so what happens is that these little chemicals will get released. These are neurotransmitters, and those get released out into the synapse, and they bind to a receptor on the next neuron in the sequence. And so these do diffuse a short distance and bind receptors on target cells. These help with sensation, memory, cognition, and of course movement. Neurohormones are just a special set of hormones that are made within the brain. And so if it's a hormone that's made in the brain, then it's going to diffuse out into the bloodstream and go throughout. That would be considered a neurohormone. And of course, one of my favorites, pheromones. These are chemical signals that are released from the body, and they're used to communicate with other individuals within the species. And so we've seen this before with ants. So the reason why ants walk in a straight line is because of the fact that they're following a pheromone trail. So if you wanted to get rid of ants, all you have to do is just break the trail, and all of the ants will then scatter, and they won't really know which way to go to get to the food or which way to go to get back to the hive. So it marks trails to food sources. We also see that if a fish is harmed, then it can release a pheromone out, which kind of signals to the other fish that there's danger nearby, so it warns of predators. And the last thing it can do is it can help to attract potential mates. So when I was in college, we did an experiment in which we put the reproductive pheromone of a moth onto a tissue, and we were able to get the male moths to attempt to mate with the Kleenex. It's kind of cool. So there's three main classes that we have with our hormones. You have your polypeptides, which would be your proteins and your peptide hormones. And so these hormones are traditionally going to be polar. You have your amines, which are going to be derived from the amino acids. And then you also have your steroid hormones. And steroid hormones are going to be nonpolar. And so this example of steroid hormones would be like testosterone. And then an example of polypeptide hormone would be insulin. So here you can see those examples. Our water-soluble examples would be insulin and then epinephrine. And so both of these are going to have receptors that are on the membrane. And over here we see our lipid-soluble. So example of a steroid hormone would be cortisol. An example of an amine steroid would be the thyroxine. And so these are both lipid-soluble, which means that their receptor must be intracellular. So just a quick reminder from chapter 11, the pathway that the hormones are going to go through differs slightly between whether it's a water or a lipid-soluble hormone. If we're looking at a water-soluble hormone, it's going to be excreted by exocytosis. Why? Because the hormone is unable to pass through the membrane, because the membrane is, of course, nonpolar on the inside. And so water-soluble hormones have to be excreted by exocytosis. Once they're in the bloodstream, they can travel freely because they are water soluble, and the plasma of the blood is primarily water. And then they're going to bind to cell surface receptors because, again, they're unable to pass through the membrane. Lipid-soluble hormones can diffuse directly across cell membranes. So they're able to just diffuse across the membrane into the bloodstream. They travel in the bloodstream bound to transport proteins, so they have to have some type of transport protein that allows them to semi-dissolve within the bloodstream. And then they're going to diffuse through the membrane of the target cell. So the receptor is going to have to be intracellular or inside the cell. And then there's three key events that will occur within this cell response signal. So first we have reception. Reception is when the signal binds to the receptor molecule or the receptor protein. Once the reception happens, it's going to have a conformational change in shape. So the shape changes, which then causes signal transduction. Signal transduction is where we looked at the phosphorylation cascade, and we looked at the secondary messenger molecules like the cyclic AMP and the calcium. And so this is going to allow us to amplify the signal and bring the signal from the membrane to the point where we're going to have the response. And of course, the response is whatever happens due to that signal. So if we're talking about insulin, Insulin is going to cause more glucose protein so that we can take up more glucose from the bloodstream, so we'll be able to bring glucose into our cells. So that would be an example of a response. So here we see a graphic that demonstrates all the parts. Remember, reception is when the hormone or the signaling molecule is going to bind to the receptor, which is going to cause a conformational change. It then goes through the transduction, which brings the signal into the cell. It brings it from the receptor all the way to wherever we're going to have the response at. And then the response will occur based on whatever the signal is and whatever the pathway that it went through was. So an example of a water-soluble hormone would be epinephrine. Epinephrine works with the fight or flight. And so if you get really nervous about something, if you're really anxious, you're either going to fight that fear or you're going to run away or flight. And so there's going to be a lot of different responses that the body has to epinephrine. Your eyes are going to dilate to allow you to get more sunlight and more light into your eyes so you can kind of determine and see better. You're going to see that there's going to be blood diverted away from your GI tract because you're not going to need to digest when you're trying to run away from something. Blood is going to be moved and diverted to your heart and your brain and your muscles to allow you to fight and run away. And so the way that this works is it's also going to bind to receptors on the plasma membrane of the liver cell. And what that does is it causes the release of glucose. If you're needing to fight something or run away from something, you need to have a higher amount of glucose so that your cells can go through cellular respiration, thus they have the ATP to be able to work to fight you, to allow you to fight whatever it is that you're fearful of or run away from whatever it is. Another example we could use would be in our lipid-soluble hormones. Traditionally, a response for lipid-soluble hormones would be a change in gene expression. They can act as transcription factors, so they can either turn on or turn off gene expression. So steroids and thyroid hormones and the hormonal form of vitamin D traditionally are going to enter the target cells and bind to some type of receptor in the cytoplasm. It's then going to have the protein and the receptor complex will then move into the nucleus, acting as that transcription factor that I mentioned before. We did see an example of this with testosterone earlier this semester. And here we have the example of estradiol. So estradiol is the steroid hormone for females traditionally. Yes, males still have it, but there's a higher amount of it in females. So the hormone is going to move past the membrane. It's then going to bind to the hormone. It's going to bind to the receptor inside of the cytoplasm. It then moves into the nucleus so that it can act as a transcription factor to turn on the making of the mRNA, which will then allow you to make that appropriate polypeptide. So a lot of times we have the signal in local regulators, as we mentioned before with paracrine signaling. This is traditionally a non-hormonal chemical signal. And so some examples would be cytokines. So we talked about cytokines in chapter 43 when we talked about the immune system. The cytokine is released by the helper T cell to then allow the nearby cells to come bind and allow us to get the appropriate plasma cells and the appropriate cytotoxic T cells. We also see growth factors. Growth factors will bind to cause the cell to go through cell division. We also see nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is going to cause vasodilation. This is actually when they found the little blue pill for hearts and to help prevent against heart attack, they discovered the way that it worked was it was going to prolong the release of the nitric oxide in smooth muscles, so it caused them to have this vasodilation, which allowed certain areas of the body to have a large amount of blood flow. And then we also see with prostaglandins, this is what's going to allow you to feel pain, is that the prostaglandins are released, which causes that pain in a localized area. So if we look at a simple hormone pathway, the hormone is going to be released from some type of endocrine cell. It travels through the bloodstream, and then it's going to interact with the receptor to cause some type of response. So let's say, for example, that we have the stimulus that there's a low pH in the duodenum. The duodenum is part of your small intestines, and we want it to have a high pH to allow the appropriate enzymes to work to digest the food in the small intestines. So because of that low pH, it sends a signal to this endocrine cell that is going to release this thing called secretin. So secretin gets into the bloodstream. It's then going to bind to the pancreas, which is going to cause bicarbonate ion to be released. The bicarbonate is basic, and what that's going to do is it's going to help to increase the pH of the duodenum, and so then we will be where we need to be. So a really important example of hormones would be insulin and glucagon. I would definitely make sure that I understand and I know insulin and glucagon, because I could totally see this being one of the examples they would use. So insulin and glucagon are anti-agnostic hormones, okay? So what that means is that they work against one another. Insulin is going to reduce your blood glucose level, while glucagon is going to increase the blood glucose level. So you see how they work opposite of each other. So the way that insulin reduces the blood glucose level is that it promotes the cells to take up the glucose. There's a high amount of glucose in the bloodstream, and if the cells take up that glucose, then there's less blood glucose in the blood. Also, it's going to slow the glycogen breakdown in the liver. Glycogen is how we store glucose. And so what happens is by slowing that process of breaking it down, there's not as much glucose released into the bloodstream. And then it's also going to promote fat storage. We're going to take up this glucose and there will be conversions into, of course, fats. Glucagon does the exact opposite. And I like to always say glucagon is released when the glucose is gone, just to kind of help me. But it just means if I need to increase the amount of blood glucose, then I'm going to release the glucagon. So what the glucagon does is it stimulates the conversion of glycogen into glucose. So it's going to take that long string of the long string of polymers of glucose, and it's going to break off little glucose particles, which will release it into the bloodstream, of course, increasing the blood glucose level, as well as also stimulates the breakdown of fats and proteins into glucose to, again, also raise that glucose level.
When food is ingested, it travels along the digestive tract, where it is broken down into its component nutrients in order to be absorbed into the bloodstream. One such nutrient is glucose, a simple sugar. Glucose gets absorbed by the stomach and intestines and then enters the bloodstream. It travels through the circulation to all body cells. Once absorbed into the bloodstream, glucose circulates, causing the blood sugar level to rise. An increased level of blood sugar sends a signal to the pancreatic beta cells, which respond by secreting the hormone insulin into the circulation. Insulin is necessary for glucose to reach and be used by several important target tissues throughout the body. These include the liver, muscle, and adipose tissue. Insulin is necessary to keep blood glucose levels stable in the body. Glucose enters the cell through a process called facilitated diffusion.
So there tends to be this coordination between the endocrine system and the nervous system. Okay, so there's a certain part of the brain, very, very important part of the brain, called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus receives information from the nervous system and then initiates responses through that endocrine system. So we're going to see that a lot of times the hypothalamus receives the signal that then causes the body to do the different responses. So attached to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, and this is where we're going to see a lot of different hormones being synthesized and secreted and released. Okay, you're not going to have to know where the hormones are coming from. I just wanted to give you this information just so that you kind of have a little bit more understanding when you see these type of questions. But the posterior pituitary is going to store and secrete hormones made in the hypothalamus, while the anterior pituitary makes and releases hormones under the regulation of the hypothalamus. So here's a chart that shows all of the different hormones that your book describes. And I have put a star next to the ones that I feel are important for you to know. You don't have to have these memorized. You don't have to have them set in stone. But it would be important to be able to recognize these, because I feel like these would be the ones that they could potentially pick for questions. So oxytocin is going to be a hormone that causes the contraction of the uterus. And so what happens is that this is a big example for positive feedback. The oxytocin causes the contraction of the uterus, which pushes the baby's head against the cervix. As the baby's head pushes against the cervix, that causes more oxytocin to be released, which causes even more contractions and so on and so forth. That helps to increase the contractions, which then allows delivery of a baby. Another example we have is ADH. We talked about this in chapter 44. ADH is going to work as a antidiuretic. And its whole job is to promote the retention of water, so it allows water to be reabsorbed in the kidneys. We also see the growth hormone. The growth hormone is going to stimulate the bones to grow. It also stimulates metabolic functioning. If you don't have enough growth hormone, then you would have pituitary dwarfism. If you have too much of the of the growth hormone, then you would have gigantism, and so you would see like extra tall and lengthening of the long bones. Prolactin is going to be a hormone that stimulates the milk production and secretion. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the production of the eggs and the sperm, depending on which one you make. The luteinizing hormone stimulates the ovaries and the testes. It kind of helps with the maturation of the ova and the sperm. And there's a couple other ones on here if you want to stop and read about them. So the other ones you need to know, definitely know insulin and glucagon. Insulin is going to decrease blood glucose level, while glucagon is going to increase blood glucose level. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, this is going to work against one another, and they're going to either raise the blood glucose level or decrease the blood glucose level. And they're also going to help to increase the metabolic activities, and then also they can constrict blood vessels to certain areas. And then, of course, progesterones, which are going to promote the uterine lining growth. We're going to talk about most of these hormones tomorrow, but I do want to talk about two of them today. So the two that are made by the posterior pituitary would be oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to induce uterine contractions, and it helps for the release of the milk. And so what ends up happening is the suckling, so the baby trying to drink the milk, sends a message to the hypothalamus via the nervous system, and that causes the release of the oxytocin. And oxytocin then stimulates the milk glands to further release the milk. And so this is an example of the feedback loop, which will allow the even greater response. And then another example would be the antidiuretic hormone, ADH. This helps with the reabsorption of water in the kidneys, and we looked at that back in chapter 44. So, pop-up question. In a positive feedback mechanism, a suckling baby triggers the secretion of oxytocin, which targets the mammary glands to secrete milk. Which scenario best explains what happens next? So what happens after that suckling baby triggers the secretion of the oxytocin? So we talked before that the secretion of the oxytocin is going to stimulate the milk, and it's going to continue to do that until the suckling actually stops. So good job, guys. So that is the end of 45.1 and 45.2. So there should be a endocrine scavenger hunt that the substitute should have for you to work on to kind of learn a little bit more about these different hormones and how they work within the body.